Hello everyone. This is Moderate Rebels. I am Ben Norton. I did a lengthy live stream discussion with the journalist Yasha Levine. This is the third and final part of that interview. In this part, we talk about something that is almost never covered in Western corporate media. Of course, Western corporate media in the US, the corporate media is owned over 90% is owned by 5 corporations, so it's no coincidence. We're talking about Silicon Valley and its deep links to the US government. Yasha Levine has a brilliant book called Surveillance Valley, looking at the origins of big tech corporations, of social media, of the internet itself, of computer technology in the first Cold War, and Washington's global war on communism and socialism. So in this part, we talk about the deep links of the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, the Pentagon's research arm, DARPA, to Silicon Valley corporations, and how they have served as an arm of U.S. foreign policy objectives. And we talk about how, interestingly, in the past few years with the election of Donald Trump and the rise of China, how Washington has very quickly shifted from this narrative promoting so-called internet freedom to now actively promoting more and more censorship, more and more political censorship in the name of fighting foreign so-called disinformation. So this is a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot from Yasha. And without further ado, here is part 3 of my interview with Yasha Levine.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
Rebels.
So what we're going to do in this final segment here is we're talking more about Silicon Valley, big tech. I have some questions also from our patrons at Patreon. And I do want to try to address some of the comments here on YouTube and Twitch. Like there's one comment here, talk a little bit about Lula's judgment, just because, today is March 8th. And this is really quickly, I just want to mention, because this is a really huge deal, that a Supreme Court judge in Brazil just dropped all charges against Lula da Silva, the leftist former president, the most popular politician in the country. And he was imprisoned under very bogus charges, specious charges of so-called corruption, which prevented him from being a candidate, which is what led the far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro coming into power. And we know, I would recommend the website Brazil Wire, spelled with an S, Brazil Wire. It looks at how the U.S. government, specifically the Department of Justice, FBI, and CIA, were deeply involved in the kind of soft coup against the Workers' Party there. So now we've seen that unless there's another, we'll see, there's always this internal fight going on within the Brazilian state to try to prevent the Workers' Party from coming back. But now, legally, Brazil can be a candidate in the 2022 election. So that's amazing. It's a very significant development. And here at Moderate Rebels, we're definitely going to cover that probably next week. So getting to Yasha, your other really big kind of purview, I mean, really, if I have to think of any journalist in the U.S. focusing on Silicon Valley in a critical way, I mean, you're one of the only people who come to mind. And you worked a little bit with the website Pando, and they've done some work. And you at your Substack, and then also at The Exile, which you worked at with Mark Ames, you've done some really good reporting looking at Tor. Also, I would highly recommend anyone listening and watching this check out Yasha's book, Surveillance Valley. It's a brilliant book. I mean, it was really eye-opening for me. And Yasha, I think, put his thumb on an issue that now, in the past few years, with the kind of trade war going on with China, I think it's become a more prominent view. But I think it's fair to say that after the overthrow of the Eastern Bloc and the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, we saw that there was this narrative that was pushed by some of these so-called post-Marxist scholars, specifically thinking of Negri and Hart. They wrote their famous book Empire, in which they declared that basically the nation state was no longer very relevant, and that capital was international through global neoliberal globalization, and there's this thing that they called the empire with a capital E, which refers to international capital, and that it's not really based within national borders. It's just it's transnational, and it's run by these oligarchs who have multiple passports, and they can buy their nationality in like a Caribbean country where they don't have to pay taxes, and that class exists. But I think in the past few years, with the trade war with China and with the new Cold War against not only China but also Russia, we've seen a return to this idea that U.S. technology companies are not international companies. They are first and foremost U.S. companies. They are arms of the U.S. government. They serve U.S. foreign policy interests. That's something that you've been saying for many years, even before it became as clear as it is now. So let's just start talking about what you're reporting on Silicon Valley shows when it comes to the new Cold War and what the actual function of Silicon Valley is.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's like I guess what you described there. They're is the left wing version of the sort of the end of history, right? Thesis is that there isn't really, that's it. It's like the American empire is sort of like the main thing, and then there's nothing, and it's not even American anymore. It's just global, and so that's just how it's going to stay. I mean, so the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the collapse of at the end of the Cold War, and the sort of the America emerging as the superpower, uni superpower, and the creation of the internet, or not the creation, but the popularization of the internet and the commercialization of the internet, and suddenly the take up of the technology, they happened basically at the same time, in the 1990s. And so the internet from the very beginning was imbued with this utopian, globalized vision of the technology, which posited that it's beyond the state, it's beyond a certain society, it's beyond any government even. It sort of floats on top of the world. It sort of hovers out there in cyberspace, and basically in heaven, and that it's sort of almost above human affair. It's above politics. It's above geopolitics for certain. And that, once you like log on to AOL or, later Yahoo, and then Google, and, Apple, and you do all, and you're on Twitter and you're on Facebook, you're like beyond, you're above geopolitical concerns. We're just all one humanity, communicating in unison together. It was an interesting idea. It was an interesting mythology, and I mean, it's only recently, actually, during the Trump era, really started to get chipped away. And the way that I attacked it, and the way I started thinking about it and critiquing this ideology, is when I started writing my book, Surveillance Valley. I kind of wanted to understand, where the internet came from. What's the starting point for this? And once I started kind of going back to the very origins of the technology, when it was developed during the Vietnam War by the Pentagon as a way of creating a new command and control system technology, but also was a way of developing new data tools and tracking tools to fight insurgencies, and as part of, counterinsurgency weapons. I found out that the military's role and the U.S. government's role in this technology that then became the internet never really left. I mean, it was there from the very beginning, but it also, but at every state of evolution, going into, the creation of, let's say, of Google as a company, you can see the arm of the U.S. government either underwriting the technology, that see the arm of the U.S. government and the fingerprint of the U.S. government at every step of the way. And so, yeah, I mean, it's almost silly now to think that Google is not part of the U.S. government in the same way that it's silly for people to think that TikTok is not part of the Chinese government or something like that. So it's such an accepted now view that, yeah, just a few years ago it was seen as heresy, and I was attacked and just mocked and belittled for implying that American Silicon Valley companies are actually extensions of the U.S. government and of the American empire, and aren't just like these totally abstracted entities floating, somewhere up in the stratosphere.
Yeah, well, something that you document in your reporting in your book, which is just objective, and it's something that I didn't even know until I read your reporting, is that all of these big tech companies have huge contracts with with the U.S. national security state. I mean, some people, of course, now know that because, like I said, in the past few years, I think your thesis has just become so transparent that it can't be
Yeah.
ignored anymore. But so, for instance, we know that Google has contracts with the CIA, and of course, Amazon does as well. Google has contracts with local police departments, you point out, that they use for police surveillance. Google was involved, I learned from your book, in the Iraq War, and they were working with the U.S. military on mapping programs in Iraq. I mean, so we're talking about that not only do they have their origins, like you just said, in the Cold War and developing counterinsurgency technology against communist and socialist movements around the world, but
Yep.
so they were created through, they have their origins in DARPA and the Pentagon research, but also still today they're U.S. government contractors.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, Google is such a perfect example of a company that is just, no matter where you kind of poke it, from which angle, like you see, just again, you see the role of the U.S. government in its development. I mean, just going even back to the research that into a superior way of finding information, that then became this algorithm that was called Backrub, and then it was renamed as to PageRank, and then that algorithm became kind of the core of Google when it was privatized out of Stanford by Sergey Brin and Larry Page. I mean, their research into this stuff was underwritten by DARPA, by the FBI, by other federal agencies, and because American sort of law enforcement and intelligence agencies, they were looking at like this chaos that was erupting on the internet, all these different sites that were sort of like linked together, but there was not a central index for anything. So it was almost impossible to find anything. And the early search engines that were created were really shitty. There was not a good way of actually figuring out how to sort the information, and to create something that could be easily searched. I mean, so they seeded, a program that spanned multiple universities in America to create a better search algorithm, to create a search algorithm. And so Google came out of that program and was underwritten entirely by the U.S. government and by the security state part of the U.S. government. And so that created the algorithm, and then once Google became a company, one of the first things that they did was contract that technology, that search technology, out to the CIA and to the NSA. These agencies basically bought these Google boxes that they stored in their own internal data warehouses that crawled CIA data, internal data, crawled internal NSA data, and created and search the internal data of these intelligence agencies. And I know that the CIA even modified the Google logo internally on their internal, that the crest of the CIA was in one of the O's, and they actually asked Google for permission to do that because they're kind of messing with their brand, and so Google gave that permission to the CIA, and then of course then when Google went on this sort of buying spree and started buying up all these different startups, including the startup that became part of Google Maps. That company was developed with grants, with investments from In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's sort of venture capital arm. And so, Google Earth became Google Earth, and that became part of the suite of products that Google offered to private clients, but also to government clients. And then when the Iraq War broke out, Google was working with the Pentagon to integrate Google Maps into the kind of the war machine, into the invasion forces, so you can like put down where different assets and where different troops were and things like that. And so, and that's just the very, very beginning of the company. That's in the early 2000s. And so at every stage of the way, you see Google involved in the U.S. government. And so, and then of course, to the conclusion, these are the companies, these giant companies that were a lot of the stuff, a lot of the technology that they're releasing is based on government research, but then what shocked me was that even the companies that, or the tools that are supposed to sort of fight against the U.S. government, that are supposed to protect you from big corporations spying on you on the internet, are also part of the U.S. national security state. Tools like Tor and tools like Signal, the encrypted chat app that's sort of blown up recently. These are also funded and sometimes fully created by the U.S. government. And so so not only are these giant corporations part of the U.S. empire, but also these supposedly radical tools, kind of grassroots technologies that are supposed to protect you from the U.S. empire, right, and from the U.S. surveillance state, are actually also funded by the U.S. surveillance state. And so there's when you go on the internet and you start looking around, you realize that there is almost nothing on there that isn't tied to the American, the U.S. national security state. That's just in America. And of course, when you go outside of the country, you notice that obviously a similar rule kind of holds, that frequently, technology companies are hip to whatever the state that they've emerged out of is. So whether it's in Russia or China or whatever. But speaking in terms of American companies, yeah, the entire internet, the opposition to the internet, embodied in technologies like Tor and Signal, they're all part of the same U.S. national security state. It's it doesn't matter where you go, you just see it. You see fingerprints of it all everywhere. And so yeah, that's what my book is about. But it's funny that while the idea that Google and Facebook are extensions of sort of the American government is almost now commonplace, and to the point where now people are demanding that they protect American national security interest, right? It's expected that Zuckerberg protect America because it's an American company and he's an American, he should care about America. It's still really not accepted that a tool like Signal or a tool like Tor are also I don't know how to say it, problematic technologies that don't quite offer the kind of protection you think they're offering, or that they claim they're offering you from the U.S. national security state.
Yeah, so Yasha, talk to us more about that. Why people should be skeptical of the idea that Signal, in particular, is going to solve all their problems. WhatsApp recently announced, which is owned by Facebook, they recently announced that they're changing their policy and they're going to basically farm people's information out to Facebook, as if they weren't already. But Signal was portrayed as some kind of great solution to that. But I mean, what's your take on people who say that?
That they created the app from what was called the Open Technology Fund. The Open Technology Fund is a private sort of child company of Radio Free Asia. Radio Free Asia is a sort of privatized propaganda arm of the U.S. government that targets communist countries in Asia, like China, Vietnam. So Signal was funded by this regime, kind of a regime change arm of the U.S. government. And the point of Signal, I guess, at the time was to give sort of activists or dissidents in countries that America is targeting, like let's say Vietnam or China, a way of communicating and organizing themselves and organizing their anti-government activities without and in a way that could be sort of protected from those governments. So, like, say China couldn't spy on your chats because they're super encrypted and they're totally unhackable. But so that was the point of funding it. But very quickly it became a kind of a Signal was hyped and popularized by these crypto sort of anarchist types, a lot of them who are actually on the payroll of the U.S. government. And they advertised it as like the most secure text messenger. It's totally unhackable by the NSA. Edward Snowden, lent his credibility to the app, saying that he uses it every day. He even made absurd claims saying that if it wasn't for Signal, he probably wouldn't be alive today. And so it got this sort of almost like cult status as the most unbreakable, as the most amazing, as the most secure chat app on the planet that could protect you from anybody. But of course, it offered people a false sense of security because, as we've sort of know now, actually, intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies don't really need to break the encryption of the app itself. All they need to do is break into your phone and then grab the text information before it's even sent and when it's received. So just because it has a really good encryption doesn't mean it's unhackable, and it's actually pretty easy to hack because if you can hack a phone, you can hack Signal. And so what it does is it offers people this false sense of security. People use it thinking that they're protected from whoever they're trying to hide from, but in reality, it's not so easy. And so which means that, you know, the CIA has access to it. You know, the NSA has access to it because they have the ability to hack these phones. So I don't know. It's like there's also this kind of I don't even think it's even exists anymore, because I think this is a very like Obama era kind of cultural movement in America. The idea that like we all need to be super encrypted, you know, that encryption is like the thing that'll protect us from the bad guys. It's a strange kind of movement where everything is like, you know, privacy is a political issue, you know, for the most part. Like it should be handled in the political sphere, but what it's doing is political. You know, the way that you curtail privacy is not by downloading an app, but trying to basically fight the power of our intelligence agencies that are and to fight the power of these corporations that are surveilling us all the time. And so what it did, aside from offering people this false sense of security, is this idea that they're actively engaging in politics by downloading and using an app. In reality, it's not really challenging the power of the security state in any way. It's not really challenging the power of Google or Facebook to collect information on you from you know, as much as they want or whatever they can get their hands on. So it's sort of neutering people's desire for privacy, or not even neutering, but more like you know, sort of like channeling into this kind of dead end area where you think that just by downloading and using an app, you've like solved the problem, when in fact you've done nothing. You've done nothing other than give yourself a false sense of security.
Yeah, having some weird technical issues today. But anyway, Yasha, another piece of technology in here that I want to mention is Tor. And you've done reporting on Tor. And specifically, there's a question from one of our patrons that I want to address. And he asked, Mark Owen asked if Tor and Signal components are part of full spectrum dominance. I think he's referring to that policymakers in Washington after the end of the first Cold War had this idea of full spectrum dominance, that was the goal of Washington's foreign policy. I mean, it's an interesting question, so maybe you can respond to that question. But can you also, just for people who don't know, can you talk about Tor as well?
Oh, it's funny. I guess you didn't hear. You didn't hear because I went on a rant about Tor that I don't even. I don't know. I mean, about the full spectrum dominance bit. I don't know what he really means by it. I mean, I just think that you know, Tor and Signal are actually slightly different. You know, they're different tools. Tor was created primarily to hide spies on the internet, to give them cover while they're browsing the internet, and that involved the need to sort of farm this technology out to the general public. So
Yasha, sorry, you were cut out there, but I think you kind of did a good job of answering that. You were talking about Tor. Here's an interesting question that I know nothing about, and you might be able to speak to. A patron asked this question, El Gato Blanco. I'm reviewing this book by a former writer for Epoch Times, which is the propaganda arm of the extremist Chinese cult Falun Gong. Amelia Pang, I wrote an article about her, and she has a book called Made in China, and she talks about how Falun Gong members were involved in inventing Freenet. So this patron asked if you know anything about the history of Freenet and its links to Falun Gong and potentially DARPA.
Oh yeah, God, you just cut out for like a bit. So you asked me about Freenet and the whole Falun Gong bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's not much to tell other than when the internet started to go global in the late '90s and began to penetrate China. The American sort of regime change arm of the U.S. government that was involved in sending kind of anti-China or anti-communist broadcasts over into China that had been doing for decades as part of Radio Free Asia. It started thinking like, okay, why don't we use the internet to do now? You know, technology can penetrate, it can cross borders. So we'll just also broadcast. We'll create a website, you know, and do the broadcast anti-communist propaganda into China now using the internet, right? It's pretty a no-brainer. It's a logical thing, you know, you want to do. And but very quickly, America realized that China could just simply block these websites. All China had to do was just block the IP addresses of Radio Free Asia, or block the URL Radio Free Asia. And so, Radio Free Asia began looking for contractors that could develop technology that could act as proxies, as kind of anti-censorship proxies that could allow people inside China to circumvent these blocks, right, of the internet, and to listen to Radio Free Asia. And so who did Radio Free Asia contract with? Well, contracted with the Falun Gong. And so it created these tools that, arguably didn't really work at all. But it paid, I don't remember the exact amount, but it paid, I think several $1 million over the years to Falun Gong to build and maintain this tool that allowed people in China to theoretically circumvent these censorship blocks, that were being put up against Radio Free Asia, and so that was they contracted with Falun Gong, and that was like their first attempt. In a way, it was like the first, because there was this internet freedom war that was launched in the early 2000s, and that was a part of it. So America was like, yeah, we want internet freedom. We want the whole world to have access to all the information, without censorship, without limitation. And so it started broadcasting into China, and then China was like, no, we don't think this is right. We this is a weapon. So you're trying to broadcast propaganda. We're going to jam these websites like we jammed your radio broadcasts, and so that was like the first shot fired in the internet war, in the internet freedom war. And so the next sort of shot that America fired was to create this, to fund this technology that could, in theory, go around these blocks. And so from then on, actually just kind of escalated to the point where Tor became kind of the go-to weapon that the U.S. government found could not only hide spies, but in theory could also help people in China get around these Chinese internet blocks. And so FreeGate was like the first really weapon developed to combat sort of Chinese censorship, but more like China's attempt to maintain some kind of sovereign control over its internet space. And so FreeGate was like the first weapon that was developed as a kind of a crowbar to pry open these doors and to allow America to broadcast over the internet into China unimpeded, regardless of what the Chinese government wanted to do. And so it was the first weapon. It was pretty crude, as I believe, and I know that there was a big internal spat between the Tor people and the Falun Gong people, because the Tor engineers really badmouthed the technology that Falun Gong had built and said that it's just totally useless. And in fact, Jacob Applebaum, one of the premier Tor radicals who doesn't, who's no longer associated with the organization because he was accused of sexual harassment and sexual abuse by all these people in the Tor community and the crypto community. He was a principal author of a kind of a technical policy paper submitted to maybe the State Department, telling them that you should ditch this Falun Gong technology because it's junk. And I know that when I was reporting on Tor, I got a couple of different people from Falun Gong emailing me, telling me, trying to give me all this dirt on Tor because that was their principal enemy, because they basically Tor robbed Falun Gong of a pretty serious contract to develop this technology. And so yeah, I mean, and what's interesting about these grants to build this tech is I think it's the only documentation that I've seen of an actual financial relationship between the U.S. government and Falun Gong. I mean, we know that they collaborate together. It's pretty clear. We know that Falun Gong is essentially exists in exile. And the leader of the Falun Gong exists in exile in this sprawling country mansion and compound, pretty clearly, with the support of the U.S. government. But to my knowledge, I have not seen any reporting or any evidence of an actual financial relationship between the U.S. government and Falun Gong. Although we know it exists, it must exist, and this is pretty clear evidence of the U.S. government support for this organization, for this cult that I've seen. I don't know, Ben, if you've seen anything else, any money trail
Yeah, no,
between.
I haven't seen anything direct, but like you said, that you can definitely see that there are NGOs that are linked to Falun Gong that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, and some prominent activists that work with NED, and it's usually really easy to find those people because they're always listed on the NED website.
They make it easy. Yeah.
They don't hide it at all. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because another really good question we got from one of our patrons is Seth Aronovich wrote, how closely linked do you think Falun Gong are to U.S. intelligence agencies? I know they've been engaged in the creation of a number of these censorship resistance free VPN tools.
Yeah.
The Chinese dissidents. So you addressed that, but I would not be surprised in any way to see that the support goes much deeper, and especially under Trump, where the Mike Pompeo CIA and State Department basically merged. And
Yeah.
we saw that Pompeo gave a historic speech at the Richard Nixon Library, saying that basically that he thought that the Nixon visit to China and the opening with China was a mistake, and that China is now the main enemy of the U.S. So I think it's very clear that the U.S. is supporting Falun Gong networks. But something that you said, I think, as bad as the new Cold War is in a lot of ways, I think it's been really revealing, especially on this front you were talking about, of these utopian ideas of the internet being this liberation technology for freedom. I mean, for a lot of people now, I think it's pretty funny because the internet is like enslaving us. I mean, it's like everyone jokes always on Twitter about how it's a hell site, but they still spend all their time on it, which says a lot.
No, it's crazy. I mean, it's pretty impressive. Like, so, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama, her like prime sort of like policy that she put in place was called internet freedom. So she went to the museum, in Washington, D.C., and stood and gave this big speech about the importance of information and about the importance of unimpeded information, that the world needs to talk and collaborate and work together, and that any state that limits the flow, basically made a threat that we will be targeting you, that we will not allow this. I mean, this is a very explicit threat, aimed at China for the most part. And so this was like the central program of her tenure as a Secretary of State, right? And yet, and then fast forward to when she loses Donald Trump, she's basically saying that we must, like the Russians have exploited this free system. We need to clamp down. We need to get Facebook. We need to get Google. We need to get Twitter to clamp down on this Russian disinformation. Basically, she was saying like the internet is now too free, and so she's doing exactly and calling for the policies. This was in 2016, calling for the policies that, she was just a few years earlier fighting as Secretary of State, fighting against China, right? So she's totally went and said, I agree with China. This foreign information, by these bad states, it's a problem. We should as a society regulate what our citizens see. So she's totally flipped. And then of course, that was, 4 years ago. And, the entire liberal establishment, believes that the internet is now too free. I mean, the idea that they would amass behind a slogan of internet freedom right now, it seems absurd. Can you imagine it? Like, they're actually not for internet freedom. They're for internet control, to fight this disinformation and all this horrible stuff that's supposed to be happening. So it's a totally, 100% U-turn that happened within just several years. I mean, what it took was Donald Trump winning, and like the entire establishment just freaked out and, turned on a dime and completely reneged on everything that they were saying before. And you can actually draw the line. Like, the same journalists that were praising internet freedom are the ones, now, fully invested in fighting Russian disinformation, right? The journalists that were once at the forefront of lionizing these crypto radicals who are trying to open up the internet, right? Like Andy Greenberg and Wired is one of the main guys who, wrote these glowing things about Ross Ulbricht, on Tor, and how these guys are the new freedom fighters, they're new revolutionaries because they're fighting, they're totally bucking any kind of state control over information on the internet, and that Tor was going to create this new society and all this stuff. I mean, he's turned into this, primary kind of journalists, trying to root out disinformation campaigns, by Russia, whether it's in America or Ukraine or wherever. So it's like the people that were on the internet freedom beat, the journalists who were on the crypto beat, who were basically valorizing these crypto, activists who are on the payroll of the State Department and fighting for internet freedom, right? Suddenly are all now about fighting disinformation. I mean, they've totally switched. It's kind of incredible, and it actually goes to show you. So it's like it's very instructive because internet freedom in America was always basically a State Department talking point or kind of an imperial position. You want to force everyone to open up the borders because you think that freedom benefits you. Openness benefits you, like with free trade. But as soon as you think that openness doesn't favor you, you're like, and as soon as the State Department's line is that openness is bad and dangerous, all of these journalists and all of these influencers, who were fighting the good fight for internet freedom, suddenly are all about internet unfreedom. They're fighting for control and filtering. And so it's so much of the reporting, as I found out, when I wrote the book, but also just looking at it now, it's like so much of the reporting on technology and on the internet. I mean, it's very much like foreign journalists or foreign correspondents. They're almost always echoing like a State Department line.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly who feed them the scoops. And that's certainly true for basically every mainstream national security reporter. In fact, I have this example up from a few days ago, which is really so revealing because it really shows, I mean, like you said, in just the span of a few years, the same people pushing internet freedom are now calling for the exact opposite. So this is from NPR, which is, of course, backed by the U.S. government. And this reporter...
It's state-funded media, yeah.
Miles Parks. Well, you can't say that, Yasha, because only Russian and Chinese media are that. But so this guy, Miles Parks, is a staff reporter at NPR. And of course, he like,
oh, yeah.
Mainstream reporters, they always do this thing where they try to hide their own opinion and pretend like it's objective by citing someone else as an expert. But he's saying here that he talked to this expert, this researcher, and she told me basically that it might take 50 years to resolve this. That quote, for people
this is pretty funny.
Yeah, this for people who are just listening in the podcast, this is an exact quote from NPR. Quote, basically, she says a redesign of the entire internet is the only solution. Information just spreads too easily right now. You can't get it said any more bluntly than that. I mean, what they're saying is that with the election of Trump, with so-called Russian and Chinese disinformation, in fact, now they think that everyone's under attack. In fact, we just saw that Twitter just announced that Twitter is now suspending people because they criticize NATO. Because if you criticize NATO, it means you're probably Russian assets or Russian.
You're weakening belief in the system. Yeah. No, it's funny because the internet is only 50 years old about. So it's like just from the very beginnings of the technology, the rudimentary routing technology that was developed by DARPA. I mean, it's basically 50 years old. So they're saying that it's gonna take another 50 years to create a new internet, essentially. That'll put like gatekeepers into every switch, so like this kind of dastardly Russian disinformation can't spread. So it's just such bullshit, man. It's incredible. Yeah, it's it's one of the reasons.
I have this tweet here. So I have this thing from Twitter. They said that here's the exact part from Twitter.
Under my faith.
We've disclosed networks with Russian ties, which doesn't mean anything. I mean, it could be people in Russia. But another subset of the network focused on undermining faith in the NATO alliance and stability. It's even worse than I remembered. Undermining faith. I mean, it's like religion.
It's a religion. Yeah, it's religion. Yeah, because the NATO alliance is yeah. I mean, and they're going on yeah, it's pretty fun. I mean, it's just such a fucking joke. I mean, I'll tell you this. I mean, I believe it, although it'll impact my ability to make money. I mean, just because I make money off of these tools. I mean, I have no other job now. I mean, I make money off Substack, like, so I don't get pushed by, you know, or promoted by any large organizations. So I'm almost, you know, entirely dependent. My income is dependent on social media and the ability to publish things on the internet and for them to be read by people, right? And for them to be able to pay for this stuff.
I'll use this as an opportunity to plug. Give Yasha your money. You can go to yasha.substack.com. I've actually told him he's one of the only people I subscribe to on Substack because it's consistently great.
Yeah, I subscribe to one other person, and it's a historian named William Hoagland, who writes about the founding of America and sort of the founding fathers. He's got a couple of great books on that. He's an incredible journalist. So I just give him money because he does great stuff that no one else does. But what I was, and thanks for the plug, Benzia. Please, yeah, give me your money. We're all dying over here. You know, it's pretty tough for journalists these days. But, you know, I mean, given all that, like, I think that, you know, the sooner these networks and these social media platforms like shut us all down and like basically prevent people from like congregating on them, I think probably the better it is for politics, or, you know, because what's going on now is everyone's so glued to these big kind of scandals on the internet that, you know, everyone kind of does politics by proxy through these networks. And, you know, just I'm in LA now, and it's like the local, there's no local politics. I mean, it doesn't exist, you know, so to the extent that people want to get involved, you know, most of people's energy is sort of like dissipated through the internet, unfortunately, and it can be useful sometimes, but I think ultimately it's a detriment to actual political organizing on the ground, you know, because people only have so much amount of time, and so I know that it's not like a either or thing, you know. I mean, they could exist together, but I do think that the internet in general and social media and its extreme, you know, like the addiction that people have to it, and these kind of frivolous fights that are constantly ongoing, you know, never ending. I do think it's actually bad for politics and bad for political movements in America, because you need to start somewhere, and there's just almost nothing. You know, it's like a desert out here. People aren't, you know, even like, it's just, it's really sad. And so I think the sooner that Silicon Valley cancels all of us, you know, probably the better it is for local politics, and because that's where you got to do things, you know, is you got to start at the local level, I think, and move up. But yeah, it's pretty bleak. But if they do manage to cancel us all, I mean, I'll probably be, I don't even know what I'll do for a living, but maybe society in general will benefit.
Yeah, well, as this for people listening and not watching, this commenter Zachary wrote, "The revolution will not be on the trending page."
Exactly. It's also, you got to remember, what's good for journalists is usually bad for society.
Yeah, well, that's true.
We're the ambulance chasers of you know, and so it's like, you know, yeah. So we might have to be the first ones that are what should I say? We're brought as sort of sacrificial lambs into the altar of the revolution.
Yeah,
the journalists.
We go up on the altar and they pull our heart out and eat it, but it
exactly.
might be better in the process.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up, Yasha, because we're over 2 hours here, I just want to, you know, Max and I have been trying to engage our Patreon. Speaking of, you know, journalists trying to make a living, we've been trying to engage our patrons at Patreon more. In fact, I just want to point out that this live stream is honoring our 420 patrons. So thank you. It's our 420 celebration.
That's awesome.
But
you got to kick that number up, though. Come on, patrons. Yeah.
Yeah, you can go to patreon.com/moderaterebels. Well, there was a question on here that I actually don't have an answer to about, have you seen the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma?
Yes, I have seen it. Yeah, I've seen it.
Okay, well, my understanding, I know of it vaguely. I should watch it, but my understanding of it is that it's a criticism of social media for kind of like destroying society. So maybe for those of us who haven't seen it, can you summarize the thesis and what you think about that movie?
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's trying to, the thesis, it's actually, there's an interesting thing that there's something that you probably will know about the movie, even though you haven't watched it. I mean, the thesis is they're saying that, like, you know, Silicon Valley has created this manipulative ecosystem where they're the puppet masters, and they're you know, totally controlling us and telling us what to do, and that it's dangerous and that we need to do something, but it's not really saying what we need to do, and it's not really criticizing sort of the capitalist system that underpins, the internet. They're pretending like psychological manipulation is something that just recently happened, with the internet. Whereas we know that, the creation of the public relations industry, the creation of the marketing industry, goes hand in hand with with American capitalism to basically to manipulate people into buying things that they don't need or want, and to basically create this hyper industrial consumer society that the internet is just basically a part of, right? And so they're it's a very ahistorical documentary that's like that really leaves out I don't know, just the larger capitalist ecosystem in which the internet exists, right? But what's interesting about it, that the think tank that funded this organization, I mean this documentary, it really it's the think tank that's kind of is essentially lionized and profiled in this documentary. It's like kind of this documentary focuses on all these people that are associated with this think tank. It's called the Center for Humane Technology or something like that. I can't remember exactly the name, but what's interesting about the documentary is they have all these talking heads, and one of the main talking heads is this woman who's named Renee DiResta. You might remember her from being associated with New Knowledge. Remember that organization, Ben, that was involved in running the false flag?
Renee DiResta was one of the main Russiagate fake experts.
Yes, she's the main Russiagate fake experts, and the outfit that she worked for, New Knowledge, which was founded by a couple of guys from the NSA and State Department. So this is the outfit that she used to work for before it got shut down. I mean, they ran an elaborate false flag operation on behalf of a wealthy Democratic donor, the Silicon tech billionaire named Reid Hoffman, to influence the Alabama state Senate race, if you remember. And they ran they ran a troll operation to make it look like the Republican candidate in the Alabama state Senate race was being backed by the Russians, and in reality, Roy Moore was his name. In reality, it was an op underwritten by a Democratic donor to make it look like it was Russian, so they could blame Russia for backing this guy. And so she's involved in using the internet for disinformation and manipulation. I mean, her employer was involved in trying to manipulate voters into thinking that a candidate in a democratic election, right, was being backed by foreign government, when in reality he wasn't. It was just a false flag operation. And so the documentary has her as like one of the main experts to weigh in on the dangers of the internet being used for disinformation and manipulation. And they're sort of highlighting the work of the Silicon Valley think tank. So the whole thing is very like liberal and I guess neoliberal. So that it doesn't actually call for any kind of structural change to the internet or to these companies. It doesn't call for the breakup of these companies. They call for, I don't know, like the sort of voluntary self-regulation and a new like bill of ethics for the internet or something like that. So it's interesting on some level, because they do talk about the kind of the dangers of the internet and how this technology is used to kind of influence people, but it's way overhyped, the danger. And it's also obscures and obfuscates the role that our oligarchy and our sort of capitalist system plays in creating this system. They think it could be like fixed very easily, when in reality it's not going to happen. I mean, it's like like manipulation and marketing and public relations and what they used to call propaganda. Going back to people like Edward Bernays. I mean, it's the foundation of modern American industrial capitalism. So it's not like it's going to end with a new bill of ethics for the internet, right? That's the problem with that documentary. Yeah.
And on the subject of Renee DiResta, by the way, this is her LinkedIn for people watching. It's interesting to see the revolving door in terms of these technology firms, things like New Knowledge, which work with the U.S. government, and then also things like Renee DiResta was a presidential leadership scholar. She's part of the Council on Foreign Relations and is also a national security fellow at the Truman National Security Project, alongside people like Pete Buttigieg. So I mean, it shows how these these foundations and these national security linked institutions help cultivate people as their preferred so-called cybersecurity experts who say exactly what the U.S. national security state wants to be said, but with the veneer of being an independent expert who's at Stanford University now.
Yeah, no, and it's funny that she actually omitted, not surprisingly, her work for New Knowledge, because New Knowledge, after this was outed, their role in this false flag operation to influence Alabama voters, they folded and they like rebranded, and so she's basically tried to whitewash her connection to that company. And I think Dan Cohen actually wrote about this whole thing about back in, I think, in early 2019
at the Gray Zone. Yeah, I mean, it should have been a huge scandal. Even the New York Times. Even the New York Times referred to it as a false flag operation. Like, that's not just our language. Even the New York Times said it. Like that, it was clearly a scandal. But it was called
Project Birmingham, and it was a big scandal, and that's why the company basically folded. I mean, they folded and they rebranded, because it was such an embarrassment. I mean, you have these guys. New Knowledge was actually also one of the reasons why it was founded, supposedly, was to fight disinformation online. But in reality, what it was doing was actually engaging in disinformation online, selling its services to billionaires in America to influence democratic elections. So it's interesting that, like, you see a kind of almost internal imperialism happening here, where what America does to other countries, you can see it kind of play out in the same way inside America, in a Senate race in Alabama.
Yeah, that's something we always focus at the Gray Zone. That's kind of one of our main beats. Well, a few final questions before we wrap up here, Yasha. One, I noticed that when I was looking at Renee DiResta's resume here, that she works with the Mozilla Foundation. And I'm wondering if you know much about Mozilla, which produces, they're behind Firefox and some other software. And, at the Gray Zone, we've talked a lot about the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, which are kind of the traditional conduits for CIA money that work as CIA cutouts. And then, there's Soros, which you can't mention Soros ever in a negative context, or you're an anti-Semite. But, I mean, we know that
me as a Jew, I can do that.
Apparently, he's a good billionaire, because apparently those exist. But and then there's Mozilla. I end up seeing Mozilla a lot when it comes to funding a lot of these like cybersecurity experts that are, especially the ones involved in Russiagate. So I'm wondering if you want to talk about the Mozilla Foundation.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's just one of these another pass through sort of tech fronts. I mean, Mozilla obviously makes the browser, and it's a nonprofit organization. It's sort of an open source browser, but then it has this foundations aspect. The foundation is funded by Pierre Omidyar. It's funded by the Ford Foundation. It's funded by Open Society. It's funded by the EU. It's funded by all these sort of like liberal kind of private liberal private power that use all this capital to influence ideas in our society, that use all that private capital to influence public policy and all these things. So they fund all these different experts. And so I don't know what exactly. I haven't really looked very deeply into what kind of stuff Mozilla does, but just even looking at its page right now, I just brought it up. I mean, it partners with ADL to basically probably to fight disinformation and to fight anti-Semitism. So
people who don't know, the Anti-Defamation League has a history of spying on pro-Palestine activists and anti-apartheid activists, not only in Israel but anti-South African apartheid activists. Also, the ADL has a history of spying on people who, in the 80s, who did solidarity work with Central American left-wing movements. So that's incredible. The fact that they collaborate with the ADL, which, I mean, that's
So it's. Yeah, I mean, look, it's just, I'm sure, I don't know what her, I'd have to actually look closely at the fellowships that they give out, and the, here we go. Like, I mean, they have like the open internet, open web, tech policy, tech and society, So it's basically, it's like they're funding people to influence the kind of ideas that are floating around in our society about technology and how it can be fixed or how it can be changed, and how, what we need to do with technology to meet whatever the today's problems are. So and it's obviously all liberal billionaire funded, with these very, like with ADL I'm sure ADL is, probably as like is involved in being a consultant on, extremism, right? And the spread of extremism online, and anti-Semitism. And so, yeah, so it's almost like a very classic kind of liberal way of, foundation washing our oligarchy, right? In the way that it funds the ideas that are circulating in our society. So it doesn't surprise me that she's a fellow of there. I mean, I'm sure she's like there doing, what she was doing in the documentary, which is, basically talking about how dangerous this internet is, and how the far right can manipulate you, and by using these Google algorithms, and that how we need Google to pledge to be a better steward of information, and to shut down ideas that are dangerous to society. And that's kind of her whole line, So I mean, the question is, who gets to decide which ideas are dangerous? Well, I guess it's, NGO fellows like her and Google, So it's it doesn't surprise me. I don't know.
Well, a few final things to wrap up here. Just because I mentioned him in passing, I'm wondering really quickly if you want to give us your thoughts. I mentioned Soros because, you and Mark Ames are some of the only people I've seen on the left who are brave enough to even mention George Soros, because it's true. I mean, it's 100% true that on the right, not only in the US, but especially in Europe, there is this anti-Semitic obsession with Soros. And certainly, I mean, the anti-Semitic stuff against him is ridiculous. We always, of course, thoroughly condemn that. But the reality is that because of the far right scapegoating of Soros, there is this on the left, especially on like the liberal NGO left, his name is like sacrosanct. You can never ever acknowledge anything bad that Soros might fund, that the Open Society Foundations funds. I mean, this isn't even to mention the role of Soros in the massive privatization, neoliberal campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe after the overthrow of the socialist bloc. But specifically, I just want to mention really quickly that I wrote this piece exposing this fake left candidate, Yaku Perez, in Ecuador when I was in Ecuador. And there was a smear campaign led by these liberal academics. They signed this open letter smearing me as racist and sexist. It's absolutely insane. And as part of a censorship campaign, Judith Butler, the Kamala Harris supporting postmodernist, another fake leftist, signed it, and a bunch of other people, including people who supported the coup in Bolivia. But one of the most ridiculous things in their letter is they tried to portray me as anti-Semitic because I mentioned that one of the funders of this anti-Correa activist, Manuela Pic, I don't have time to get into it, but I mentioned that one of the many funders is the Open Society Foundations. And here's the line. It's this foundation, Frontline Defenders, which funds a lot of these like so-called dissidents in countries that the US is targeting for regime change, and also the European Union. It's funded by the European Union, by Taiwan, which is another key sign. It's funded by the Ford Foundation and George Soros's Open Society Foundations. I always, when I mention him, I always make it clear that he's avowedly anti-communist because, Soros, if you go to the Open Society Foundation's website, he makes it very clear that OSF was founded in order to have a transition, as he always says, from these Communist Party ruled governments to neoliberalism. But if you ever acknowledge that, of course, you're smeared as an anti-Semite. And I point out in the article that, back in 1991, the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius wrote an article that was about spyless coups, as he said it, which actually they were not spyless, but he names a series of figures who were, quote, one of many overt operatives who helped prepare the way for, end quote, the overthrow of the former socialist governments. And he also mentions the National Endowment for Democracy and its co-founder, Alan Weinstein, who boasted, quote, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. So anyway, the point is that anyone who knows anything about Soros knows that his links go very deep in these regime change networks. And that's not to say, of course, I'm not saying, and no one serious is saying that Soros is the puppet master behind all the color revolutions. But you're not allowed to ever acknowledge his role in helping, not leading, but helping to support and finance a lot of these operations. So anyway, I mean, that was a long question, but the point is that maybe I can punt that to you really quickly if you want to just address that this is an difficult issue to address, but I've only seen you and Mark Ames at least try to take a left-wing anti-oligarch approach to understanding Soros.
I mean, you know, it's funny. It's is that I think Mark Ames wrote about this a while back. Is that Soros was the only person to receive 2 Freedom Awards. So it's like America's top foreign policy establishment. It's like the top honor from the top foreign policy establishment. I mean, like Winston Churchill got 1 award. You know, like the creator of the CIA, Wild Bill Donovan, only got 1 award. President George Bush and Bill Clinton were forced to share a single award together in 2005. And George Soros got 2 awards, and he was awarded the last one in 2013 by Samantha Power at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. But just to give you a sense of like his importance to the American foreign policy establishment, I mean, he got 2. He got more than anyone else, including the guy who created the CIA. And so, I mean, what's interesting, I think what's important to understand about Soros is that while in America he seems very, and he's sort of funded the opposition to George Bush, right? He funds all these sort of liberal projects. His money flows very, very, very heavily in sort of progressive and liberal movements in America. But in the Soviet Union, or in the former Soviet Union, or sort of the Soviet bloc, I mean, he was basically doing there what Charles Koch, was doing in America. He's trying to institute, basically a libertarian regime, a libertarian way of life, to privatize everything, to enact a privatized society. Through his investments, through his funding of politicians, through his funding of think tanks, by picking up young promising leaders and sort of training them, and then putting them back into training sessions. And so I think he's extremely destructive in the sense that he was one of the forces, one of the people, and who was hell bent on making sure that something like the Soviet Union or communism would never be able to grow again out of the soil of these former Soviet or communist states in Europe and in Russia and in Central Asia and all this stuff. So, and he of course benefited himself, handsomely from this transformation. He invested. He was one of the first and big investors in a privatized Russia. He made a lot of money in investing in these newly privatized societies. That he helped privatize, and so, I know. And just because the far right's made him into this sort of, the oligarch that it's okay to hate because he's Jewish, because they don't want to look at their own oligarchs and that are not Jewish, and so he's like become the guy that the fall guy for all the bad things that the oligarchs are supposed to do. But he's been. Yeah, I mean, and he was pretty open about it in the 90s about what he was actually doing, and the fact that he was meddling in these states, and what he was doing was foreign meddling, and he was actually meddling in the workings of so nominally sovereign societies. He's I don't know what else to say. I kind of have to go, but yeah, I don't get why. I get why he's the progressive world is so protective of him, because his money flows very heavily through it, and to admit that you take money from a very reactionary, destructive oligarch, kind of goes against the image of progressivism. Again, like you need to. It's I mean, in a way, you could say he kind of pioneered his open society. You could he pioneered this new way of doing foreign policy, but sort of conducting it through these private organizations headed by billionaires, that have a progressive and sort of liberalizing kind of image. And you can sort of conduct foreign policy, foreign policy from it, but with the added benefit that you can, the U.S. government is not officially involved. And so I think that's why he was honored twice, and got 2 Freedom Awards, is because he really played a pioneering role in this kind of NGO industrial complex as a way of running foreign policy after the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a sensitive issue because, yeah, the far right has turned him into a boogeyman while ignoring other oligarchs, but that doesn't mean that he's a good oligarch. So, I mean,
yeah. I mean, again, he's like liberal. It's it's like we were talking about. There's like the inside America view, and then there's sort of the outside America view. And so, when people think of Soros, it's like he just funds sort of progressive causes in America, right? He was anti-Bush, very vocal, right? So it's like it's easy to kind of not think about what he did overseas, right? And sort of the imperialist side of his philanthropy.
Yeah, and I have to say that as people who follow the gray zones journalism, we investigate all these regime change operations and such. And I have to say, the more and more I investigate a lot of these organizations, these regime change groups that back coups and wars and humanitarian intervention, I mean, OSF, Open Society Foundations, is very frequently a funder of a lot of think tanks in DC. And again, I'm not saying that in any way. In fact, I'm very much against the thesis that he's some puppet master. No, it's the opposite. In fact, the point I'm saying is that he's a billionaire oligarch who, like Pierre Omidyar, like a lot of these other billionaires, his money is used to help fund these regime change operations, which are run by the U.S. government, by the CIA and stuff. But the point is that he's a player. So anyway,
I mean, yeah, it's like just on a closing note. I mean, it's like it's something that always people want to like draw a hard line between the government and the private interests, right? Or like just like they want to draw a hard line between Google and the NSA, right? You really can't draw a hard line through these things. I mean, because they are part of the same machine, and what makes George Soros so powerful is kind of the state, the powerful empire that's backing him, right? And the more powerful that George Soros becomes, right, and the more that he sort of gets his way, which is to completely dismantle any kind of socialist system in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, right? The more powerful that the American empire becomes, right? So they are mutually reinforcing. They're part of the same kind of machine. I mean, and it's the same thing with with Google. It's like the bigger that the American, which is why Google is invested in, for instance, fighting China or weakening China, is because if you can open those markets, right, if let's say the Chinese government is weakened and is forced to sort of allow American companies to come in there unimpeded, it opens up a huge market for Google. And so of course Google is going to back what sort of the US empire does, right? And of course, with the NSA, it's like, because the NSA has a direct tap into Google's servers and to Google's data warehouses, it's like the bigger that Google gets, the better it is for the NSA, because Google is the eyes and ears of the NSA. It's the NSA doesn't need to implant bugs on everything anymore, right? I mean, all our phones, all our computers, they are like the bugs of the NSA, but it's not like the NSA builds these phones or even builds out the network. So it's all mutually reinforcing, and so it's the same thing with George Soros and a lot of these private interests. And so you can't really draw a hard line between what's private, right, and what's part of the government, so to speak.
Yeah. I know we're going to get smeared because we dare to talk about this. They're going to say we're anti-Semites and red, brown, or whatever. But I appreciate the analysis.
Look, as a Jew who escaped Soviet anti-Semitism, I bless you, Ben Norton, and for never and never and never. Here, I'm going to take out this little. Hold on, I got a little some little pomegranate juice that I can spray on you. Here, hold on. So I'm gonna.
It's pomegranate too. Perfect.
I bless you, Ben Norton. You can no longer be called an anti-Semite or ever say anything ever anti-Semitic ever again, no matter how anti-Semitic you actually are.
Well, the final thing, I swear this is the last question, and then I'm going to let you go, Yasha. I know you have to go. I noticed that you did a podcast episode about Adam Curtis's new documentary series, Can't Get You Out of My Head. And really quickly, I mean, I would invite people to listen to his talk. I agree with a lot of his analysis. But just in a few minutes here, just while we wrap up, the last thing, I'm wondering if you wanted to just kind of comment briefly here about what you thought about that series. I'll briefly say that because I watched all 6 parts, and I think it's interesting. I think for America, I like a lot of Adam Curtis's movies, and I think that he's a provocative thinker and has an interesting viewpoint, even though I don't always agree with him. And he definitely does have some kind of anti-communist sentiments that are still really deeply rooted. But I think at the same time, he can see through a lot of imperialist propaganda, Cold War propaganda. And I think for a lot of Americans, especially, who are, the U.S. is a deeply ahistorical country in the sense that everything is rooted contextless outside of history. History is not taught well in schools. And I think a lot of that historical context is important for Americans. But I think it's an interesting documentary series. Anyone who's watching can check it out on YouTube. And he has some interesting stuff looking at the history of the Cold War. He investigates some of the CIA's role in supporting some of these fake opposition groups, in encouraging certain conspiracy theories that are ridiculous while ignoring conspiracy theories that are real. So we know that there's actual like false flag conspiracies, like the Illuminati is a ridiculous conspiracy that we know that the CIA was partially involved in helping to push. But I mean, one of my main critiques of the series is that I think partially because of the problem, if you're making a film, you have to make the film in a kind of narrative way, which automatically it forces you into a kind of liberal analysis of history that has like a narrative analysis of history as opposed to understanding like a more materialist analysis of history. So I think often that he has this kind of like, I saw someone describe it as like a reversed Marxist thing where he flips the base and the superstructure, and like he blames like major historical shifts on like certain individual personalities and certain cultural whims.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah.
Like when it comes to individualism, instead of he doesn't talk about like I mean, he talks about the technological shifts that give rise to individualism, but he doesn't talk about neoliberalism as like the economic movement in Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, and as a sense that like, now in his series, I think he correctly talks about how we're living in this crisis moment where it's like neoliberalism is dying, but instead of talking about it in the sense of a reflection of like the global political economy, it's kind of a reflection of culture. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, there's so much we can talk about it. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I'm wondering what you thought about that series.
I just have trouble generally. I mean, I don't know. Other people might be experiencing the same thing. I actually suffer from like information overload. Like I actually I'm sure there's going to be some kind of medical condition, that's going to emerge out of people because it's just too much fucking information coming at us from everywhere. It's like no matter what surface you look at, there's information, moving images or whatever coming at you. And so like I remember like like during the the sort of the crisis in the Weimar Republic, I guess, when there was like this crazy inflation that was happening. There was actually like a medical condition where people couldn't stop writing zeros, like because it was just like numbers stopped like making any sense because in an hour like things just jump by 1,000-fold, and so like people just had this kind of medical condition where they just would write nonsensical numbers over and over and over again. I mean, I feel like I'm almost at that point, with information, like I'm not quite not quite a total psychotic breakdown, but close to it. And so for me, it's hard for me to watch Adam Curtis's new stuff without like just almost like rejecting the information. It just doesn't affect me in the same way that it used to. And I don't know if it's because I'm so overloaded with information. I'm making kind of a personal critique of it. It's not really that like structural, or I'm just kind of used to his kind of tropes and used to the way that he structures things, that it doesn't hold me in the same kind of way that it hypnotically holds you. Like, his filmmaking extremely beautiful and hypnotic, and it sort of is able to like inject these ideas into your head without really, it's almost like brainwashing on some level, because it just almost turns off relaxes your brain, when you're watching these images and the great music that he puts onto them. It didn't have the same kind of effect on me, so I couldn't really watch it. All I saw were like little like almost like superficial or small, little just things that he passed over or things that he didn't mention. So I was more annoyed by that, but I don't know if I'm just like immune to that kind of filmmaking now, just because I'm overloaded with information. I think it's, I didn't finish this series. My like big critique that I have, and actually my wife and I, we were talking about this on the episode, we both have this. And in fact, she kind of brought it to my attention because she had read this book by this Russian scholar who is actually in UC Berkeley now. Yurchak is his last name. I think Yuri Yurchak. And he wrote this book. It was, and he posited this theory of hypernormalization. He like came up with the idea, and he came up with this theory to explain this disillusionment that he saw in Soviet society, where like you kind of ape the official ways of speaking, but they don't mean anything anymore to you, and you can sort of like, it's almost like becomes a joke, and you can parody it, but you don't even know it's a parody or not because it's so close to reality. But to him, it signaled kind of the breakdown of society and the total lack of belief in any kind of, not the language, but also the values of society in the late Soviet Russia. And he used it to apply it to America. And this was like back in, I think it was like maybe 2009 or 2010. So it's pretty early. And so what troubled me about like, and what troubled my wife, and then we kind of saw it in different movies of his as well, is that he kind of like steals these ideas from people and doesn't really give them the proper credit, which I know it can be hard in the kind of style that he does. His style, very narrative, very kind of, it doesn't really leave a lot of room to talk about references or where he got the idea. But I think it's kind of fucked up. He kind of took this guy's idea and put, the name, he titled his documentary Hypernormalization, which he released after Trump won. And, and he kind of took the whole conceptual framework that this guy developed, this academic developed, and he never really gave him credit. And in fact, even in like interviews now that he gives, promotional interviews, when he brings up hypernormalization, he just like maybe mentions, oh yeah, there's this Russian scholar that sort of came up. He never gives. So there's like kind of there's like an intellectual thief quality to him, which kind of bothers me as a journalist and as a kind of as a historian. You always want to give proper due, especially when you make it the center of something that you make. And so I don't know. That's kind of his tendency to do that kind of bothers me. But other than that, I really respect him as a journalist, as a documentarian. I mean, he's just because it doesn't work on me anymore doesn't mean it can't influence people and get them to really think more deeply about the stuff that he talks about in his films. I mean, he's definitely created a whole new. I mean, almost like a documentary style, which is pretty unique and incredible. I mean, documentaries have been. No one's really messed with the format, I don't know, for a long time. And so he's created almost a new kind of a new way of making a documentary that I don't know, that I even see, like, I don't know, that you don't really see anyone. So I got to give him credit for that. So I think he's a really talented artist.
Yeah, no, I agree. His films are very good, and as someone who, I've made some documentaries, mostly shorts. It's very difficult, especially for long form pieces. It's very difficult to maintain that thread and weave through a narrative. I mean, ultimately, one of my main critique of him is simply a reflection of the problem with trying to do complex political analysis through film, is that you to make it entertaining, you have to make it a narrative, but history doesn't work in a narrative, and history doesn't work with like, I mean, I agree with you that there's like this massive information overload. And if you watch his films, especially the most recent 6, I can't get you out of my head, he just like takes all this random information and tries to weave it together with a narrative that I don't think is necessarily very convincing with like individual personalities, but it's worth watching. And I think it's refreshing considering that was produced by BBC, which is otherwise just like, basically everything else on BBC is just pure national security state propaganda. So it's
we live in a kind of a documentary moment, right? Documentaries are hailed as like the new storytelling. It's like journalism isn't really journalism unless you make a documentary about it. But you're right. I mean, I'm actually right now struggling to fucking edit the documentary about these billionaires who are privatizing water in California and are using their power to influence foreign policy, including lobbying for sanctions against Iran because they're involved in the pistachio trade and all this stuff. But just going into it, I'm primarily I write, and so I'm used to going into any kind of depth that I want to, and keeping it entertaining and kind of keeping it readable. But you can go on tangents and get into some to the details and get into the weeds and not lose people. But with the documentary, you have to radically simplify everything because there's just only so much information that you can transmit in this kind of format. And because if you start to overload people, people turn off. It's like the brain can't handle it. It doesn't process. I guess the visual nature of the documentary just makes it very difficult. And so we struggle with that, when we're editing it. We don't want to oversimplify things to the point of not it being kind of not telling the truth, because it can veer towards that, it's like very easily, because you just fudge things a little bit. It just becomes a lot more easier, and to make it about personalities and to make it kind of simple. But yeah, that's why I think you see so many documentaries, just going purely on the emotion. It's all just about emotion. It's about personalities. It's about, uplifting story of some poor person or some disadvantaged person. And you're just sort of using them, living through them vicariously and experiencing life through them vicariously. But it's very hard to make a documentary that's factually correct, sort of rigorous. It's just difficult. It's not the format for it. The format invites improvisation, invites a kind of a looseness with facts, and almost like an impressionistic way of treating the world, which actually fits. I mean, Adam Curtis totally mobilizes that aspect of the medium, I think, because he creates these lyrical, impressionistic kind of works, right? That are kind of divorced from reality in a major way when you actually start to look at the things that he's talking about, but they do it in a way that still impacts you and makes you think about all these different contradictions and all these different flows of ideas and how some idea here can influence a person there to make them. But it's still personalized, and I totally agree with your critique. I think it's right on. The personalization of it makes it watchable, but also makes it kind of not true, right? Yeah.
Well, on that note, I'm going to leave it here. We'll wrap up the live stream. I'm going to let Yasha go and then answer a final few questions from commenters, but I've held him too long here. But I think it was a really.
I got to go to the bathroom. Just I'm like,
Cool.
unless I got a pot here that I could use in my seat.
You got to get the live stream set up, where these Twitch people sit in their chair for 8 hours, and I guess they just go in a cup or something. I don't know.
I was thinking about that. Yeah, you can just you can set the thing up right here. Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking about that.
But thanks so much, Yasha.
Next time when we go to do an 8 hour, we'll do an 8 hour monster stream.
Yeah, speaking of information poisoning and overloading people.
I know. I'm engaged in it as much as anyone else.
Yasha, do you want to just plug whatever you want before you leave?
Yeah, just my Substack, yasha.substack.com. Yeah, check it out. Not much else you can do there.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Yasha. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me on, Ben. All right, take care.
Great. And so now I'm just going to wrap up here and just answer a few questions that I had from some commenters and then also on our Patreon. So you can go to patreon.com/moderaterebels. I tried to respond to all the questions that we had there, and there's a few left. So I'm going to, and like I said, Yasha, you can support him at yasha.substack.com. So this is one of the remaining questions over at Patreon, and here patreon.com/moderaterebels. Ali Zuhairi said, do you all see a shift in the independent media space where outlets like The Gray Zone, Yasha's work, Black Agenda Report, and Shadowproof will be continually and further marginalized, and other independent outlets who maybe aren't so critical are thorough or heralded by as a voice by, of, and for the American left? As an example, my YouTube algorithms love outlets like Democracy Now! And The Majority Report. It doesn't like The Gray Zone, Richard Medhurst, Black Agenda Report. I think that hits the nail on the head. That's definitely what's happening. and I'll say that, I mean, at Democracy Now, it's pretty shocking to see how they've gone. I mean, Democracy Now has become shockingly echoing the State Department narrative in its coverage, and especially on China. We've published at the Gray Zone a kind of detailed look at that. Also on Syria, Democracy Now totally dropped the ball. In fact, there's an article that I've been working on at the Gray Zone that's going to look more kind of clinically at the Gray Zone's coverage of foreign policy. I mean, it goes back also to Libya, when they were pretty supportive at first of the NATO intervention in Libya. So unfortunately, Democracy Now has really moved to the center in a lot of ways. And then with the election of Donald Trump, Democracy Now is pushing a lot of Russiagate narratives and bringing on people who support the U.S. national security state, like Kurt Eichenwald. I mean, the tentacle porn guy. I mean, pretty shocking that Kurt Eichenwald was on Democracy Now. But I think the reason that those kind of like center left websites like Democracy Now and the Majority Report are supported in the algorithm is because they don't talk about so-called controversial issues involving the empire. They don't challenge the dirty war on Syria like we do. They don't challenge Russiagate. And it's very clear that the censorship that we were talking about today with Yasha, it's censorship targeting not just left-wing websites, but websites that challenge national security state narratives, bipartisan narratives about Russia, China, Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, all of like the big bad boogeymen that you're supposed to fear. We're supposed to believe that they're challenging us and they're a threat to U.S. national security. And we've just been talking with Yasha about how there's an entire cottage industry of organizations, of think tanks, of so-called scholars, of pundits, many of which are linked to the U.S. government, to Western governments. They're funded by them. And they have invested a lot of money into crafting these narratives that there's disinformation, that the disinformation is such a huge threat to U.S. national security, and we have to censor this information, which is factual, but because it's supposedly going to help Russia or help China or whatever. So basically, there's this whole narrative that's been weaponized, especially since Trump won the election, that we have to censor this information because it's helping Russia, it's helping China. And as the Cold War, the new Cold War escalates, we're going to see more and more of it. So it's absolutely true that our reporting and the reporting of people like Richard Medhurst and Black Agenda Report, Jimmy Dore, is hurt by the algorithm. That's absolutely true. Whereas the kind of center-left liberal outlets like Democracy Now that don't rock the boat, that are funded by big foundations. I mean, they get huge foundation money, and they're a multi-million-dollar operation at this point every year with around $12 million per year in their budget. So they're a major media operation. And with that foundation money often comes that kind of center-left, milquetoast, pro-democratic party politics. And you can look at our reporting, you can look at Yasha Levine's book, Surveillance Valley, looking at how Silicon Valley is such an integral part of this information war being waged by Washington, how Google, which owns YouTube, how Facebook, which owns Instagram, and how Twitter all more than voluntarily collaborate with the censorship efforts. Of course, at Twitter, they actually employ an active member of the psychological operations unit for the British Army. He is actively involved in what they call information war, and he was hired by Twitter. Twitter knows this. Until recently, it was publicly broadcasted on his own LinkedIn profile. And what does he do? He oversees Middle East editorial content for Twitter. So we know that these Silicon Valley companies are censoring things on behalf of Western governments. And the most clear example is on behalf of Israel. There's so much reporting now showing how Facebook specifically censors so much content, especially from Palestinians, because the Israeli government asked them to do it. We also know that the very right-wing government of India, of Narendra Modi, who's very pro-Western, India used to have a very independent foreign policy. India actually, under Nehru, the socialistic former leader who helped lead the anti-colonial resistance movement, India had a very independent foreign policy and was a co-founder of the non-aligned movement. Well, we've seen under the far right Narendra Modi government, which is very neoliberal, that they're working more and closely with the West, and Facebook is helping his government censor content. And by the way, speaking of that, today is March 8th. In a few days, Joe Biden is going to hold the first conference ever held by the so-called Quad. The Quad is an anti-China alliance led by the U.S., and it's an imperialist alliance consisting of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. And it's kind of like a new NATO. It's aimed at trying to weaken and contain China. So, I mean, all of these efforts are linked. The social media censorship is really exacerbating. It's accelerating because of the new Cold War. And, there's a lot we could talk about there, but, we're over 3 hours now. So I'm just going to go through and take the last few questions. I think I've addressed most of the questions on Patreon. So if there's a few questions here on YouTube, if anyone has a final few comments, I'll respond to them. This is a good one from friend of the show, always supports us. Very glad to see her commenting. Faint Signals from Vega, who is actually in Australia. I've been on her stream before. Amy Goodman pulls in over $1 million a year. Why do they keep asking the public for money? Well, that's just Amy Goodman. I mean, Democracy Now!, like I said, a few years ago, the last time I looked at their tax documents, they were operating on around $11 million budget, which is a lot of money. And only a tiny percentage of that, like around 500,000, came from individual donations. So they're basically almost all of their funding comes from rich people and large foundations, big foundations that have huge endowments. So, I mean, whether or not you can even call Democracy Now! At this point independent media is questionable. I mean, I wouldn't. It's part of the liberal media ecosystem. They regularly have New York Times reporters on to talk about whatever national security story is popular this week. So unfortunately, they've lost a lot of their cred when it comes to reporting on the empire. And Faint Signals from Vega also pointed out, my country, Australia, is propagandized to the hilt. And yeah, there's ASPI, the hilariously named Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is funded by, it's basically a cutout of the Australian Defense Ministry. It's funded by other governments and big corporations, and NATO, that's trying to push the Cold War on China. And all of these countries are pushing the new Cold War on China. And the arms industry is, of course, has a huge vested interest in trying to amplify the so-called China threat, because they're going to make a ton of money in the new Cold War. So ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is pushing a lot of the anti-China, very misleading propaganda, which is very loosely based on fact. I mean, they have this little dweeb who's like this teenage fake researcher who does some tweets and actually doesn't speak any of these languages, but is clearly fed ridiculous bogus intel that he then regurgitates and pretends like he's some scholar when he can barely do research at all, and he can't even use Google Maps correctly. And he thinks that that on this mapping technology that these schools in China are concentration camps, and it's really ridiculous. But I think at this point I'm gonna wrap up here. I mean, we hit a lot of topics. There was so much to address. But I will say that we're going to do more of these live streams, especially here at Moderate Rebels. We're trying to grow this channel. We also have the Gray Zone. We're going to do more live streams there. But I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to ask you if you can please go here and subscribe. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to this channel. And then what I'm also going to say is that we've launched a Twitch channel, which I don't really get that well. Twitch is it's a whole other world to me. But we are on Twitch. So if you want to go to twitch.tv/Moderate Rebels, if I'm actually going to mute this here, you can go to Twitch there, and please subscribe and help us grow that channel. And last thing is, if you want to go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels and Yasha Substack, you can support all of those. So it was a fun stream. I always like chatting with our fans and seeing what they have to say. Okay, and we are going to end there. This was the third and final part of our interview with the journalist Yasha Levine. This was part of a live stream that we were doing. So if you have been watching it on YouTube, thanks. If you have been listening to it, that's great too. I mean, we always do a podcast and a video version, and we're going to do more of this in the future. If you want to support this show, please consider going to Moderate Rebels. If you want to support this show, please consider going to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And as always, thank you so much for listening and watching. We will see you next time.